What's up, podcast listeners? This is your host, Rafał Matuszewski, and I'm bringing back another edition of my car vlog podcast thing. Some shout outs because I did look beforehand. Number one, hopefully I don't mispronounce it. Out in Texas, a city called Odessa, something like that. So I apologize, but shout out to Texas. I don't think I've ever had Texas on my top 3, let alone my top 1. So shout out to everyone in Texas listening to my show. Again, number 2, this was same as last time, is Miami, Florida. Shout out to everyone in Florida listening to my show. And number 3, again, we got London, England. Shout out to everyone in London listening to my show. Super cool to have you guys all the way across the water listening to my rambles about health and fitness. And today, feel like it could be a little tangent, rant, or whatever you want to call it, about, I don't even know how I'm going to start this, but here's the thing. I see this all the fucking time. People come in and start lifting heavy shit and things start hurting. Not in a good way. You're not like sore from a workout. It's more so my joint hurts, my muscle over here hurts. What the hell's going on? So an example of this is, say your typical person that sits all the fucking time, does that 5 days a week at work for 8 to 10 hours and then sits at home because they're tired of sitting at work, and then they do some more sitting over the weekend because they're tired from the sitting at work, and their hip starts changing structure because it, like, again, our tissues adapt to the stress that we place on it. So it realizes that, hey, you don't ever extend your hip other than standing. So any further extension that you need, I'm going to take away because it's useless for you. And then you go to a gym and you place a barbell on your back and you try to do some barbell squats. Since your hip can't extend the way it should, that barbell squat is not actually not giving you any kind of benefit to your body because you're now squatting without a hip. Your hip is not acting like a hip should. So why would you place forces that require extension in your hip when there is no extension? Over time, you're putting stress into a tissue that can't adapt to it compared to a hip that has full extension. Eventually the tissue yields and ow, my hip has a pinch every time I do this thing. Right? This is what happens. Let's take it a step further. If you are a person living in this century, your shoulders are pretty much fucked as well. So now you go to the gym and you take a barbell and start driving it up over your head. And then your shoulder hurts. Your physio says it's your rotator cuff muscle. It's your capsule. It's your whatever. It's not working the way it should. And then you wonder why it's not working the way it should when you're placing force and load into a joint that's not an actual joint. So when I teach other coaches or my patients how a joint works, and I hope people listening, people watching will get this a little bit easier, is that if I have 2 bones side by side like this, and I am facing both knuckles towards each other, and there's a space in between. And now imagine my right hand and my left hand mirroring each other, and say if I take my right hand and lift my right elbow towards the ceiling, that's my joint moving in space and time. With the space between the 2 bones, which are my fists, think of a surrounding globe. Think of our Earth, our beautiful Earth, that is engulfed through that, and that's our joint capsule. It's a bunch of tissue that surrounds the joint that allows movement. So if you imagine, as I'm moving my elbow up towards the ceiling, and think about that's your shoulder going up. As my bone goes up, the surrounding capsular tissue has to be pliable enough to move along to give you that range. So if you think of like one of those stress balls that you squeeze, like imagine if you had a stress ball right in the middle of your hand and you squeeze as hard as possible, it's going to start pushing out in other directions. So now imagine if you just take half of the squishy stress ball and then you squeeze, it's going to come out all into one side. And that's essentially how our joint capsules work in order for our joints to move effectively. If that joint capsule doesn't allow that movement, what will happen is, if I'm looking at the camera, my right hand and left hand will eventually collide and pinch. And that's where people will be like, oh, I get this pinch in my left hip every time I squat at this depth. That's what's happening on the inside of your hip. Your two bones that make up the joint are coming together, and they're like, the joint capsule won't work. So at another level of this idea of when people don't have a hip or shoulder, their capsule is dysfunctional. Like, it doesn't work the way it should. So then I go back to my old saying that I've done the last 2 years, is that you're building strength over dysfunction. Like, if you don't have a healthy capsule for your hip, your shoulder, your wrist, your elbow, whatever the fuck it is, why do you think it's a good idea to place load that is supposed to move a certain way with a healthy joint? Right? You got to remember, like, think about Olympic weightlifters. They have really good joints. They're able to squat ass to grass, which means they have really good knee joints, really good ankle joints, really good hip joints, and on top of that, really good shoulder joints to place a barbell on their back to go into that deep squat or a front squat position. Like, their joints are built for those types of movements. But then you take a general population person that decides to join a CrossFit gym, or a gym that wants to be a CrossFit gym without the name to be whatever person, some special gym that thinks they're better than CrossFit gyms, and a regular person starts doing these things with no like prerequisites of what a joint is supposed to be like. And then you wonder, why does my shoulders always hurt? Why does the inside of my elbow always hurt? Why does my hips click, crack, whatever it is? It's because you don't have a full functioning joint, right? So many of us want to exercise and, you know, get the benefits of exercise and do classes and do whatever activity you can think of. But if your joints can't even do the bare minimum of physical everyday life, why do you think placing external loads and forces that go beyond those ranges is a good idea, right? An example of this is people who decide to go running to lose weight when they haven't exercised since high school and it's been about 2 decades. For sure, that person doesn't have enough ankle range of motion, enough knee stability produced by the hip. They probably don't have a hip. They have terrible core activation, so they can't stabilize their lumbar spine. And then after their first run or two, they're like, I have shin splints, my feet hurt, my knees have pain, and my low back is killing me. That is one of the greatest examples that I give to coaches and to people when it comes to them trying to achieve fitness and health goals. So we all need to kind of focus on the basics. Like, exercise is an interesting thing because so many people skip the basics. They skip steps 1 through 5 and end up at 27. when everything else in life, like, makes sure that he has to like go through a step-by-step process. And it makes no sense to me that people would follow this kind of logic. Now, when it comes to exercise again, by skipping these steps when you don't have a shoulder or a hip, you're leading yourself to injury. And again, I tell patients all the time, it might not happen tomorrow, might not happen a month from now, might not happen from 6 months from now, but maybe in a year or two, you decide to go grab a sock off the ground and your entire back explodes and tells you to F right off because that tissue has yielded the maximum amount of force it can take because of your shitty hip mechanics or shitty shoulder or whatever it is, and now you're sitting in a physio office or a chiro office trying to figure out what the hell happened, right? This is why, like, the chiro I work with, Sarah, and myself have joined forces together, because what a chiropractor does and what a trainer does has to coincide. So if I know I get a client that has terrible shoulders and hips, I'm not going to give them overhead pressing and deep squats when they have no business doing it, you know? So to kind of wrap this up, because I can like rant on this for like a full hour, you need to reassess your body's mechanics. You need to see where you're at. Like, it's something as simple as like, should you be taking blood pressure meds? I don't know. Maybe you should check your blood pressure by a professional, and then they can determine whether or not you need it. So exercise is the same thing. Do I have a hip or a shoulder? I don't know. Get assessed by a professional, and then determine what exercises you should be doing or not doing, right? It's like that simple. But for some reason, people have this idea in their head is that they move like a gymnast. They move like a body should, but we don't. Like, we don't live in a world anymore where our bodies should move the way it should. You know, like back in the day before what we have now, your body could run for its life because a cougar was running after you. You know, back in the day, you could climb a mountain to go find whatever you were finding, or getting out of danger, or pulling yourself up because there was a flood coming. Like, I don't know. Like, our bodies were designed to do those things, but now living in a world that we do, our body has adapted to no activity, and it wants to keep us there. So, man, that was a good rant. Follow the basics. Like, literally everything in life, when you master the basics, you will succeed. So you can apply that to so many different facets of whatever you're trying to do in your life. So when it comes to exercise, make sure your shoulder acts like a shoulder. Make sure your hip acts like a hip. And then you can do that for every single joint. If it doesn't act the way it should, then you're going to run into problems down the road. And it's just a matter of time before you go, holy shit, my back is effed. What the hell happened, right? It's good to like investigate what's going on with your body. Like, we live in these bodies every single day of our lives, so it would make sense to understand it a little bit. And that's why I think my patients are doing really well during this pandemic, when both myself and Sarah the chiro can't see, because we've given them all the tools and education to understand what's going on with their body. Like, we literally don't really have that many patients that are in dire need of treatment because they have reached out to us. We kind of refresh their memory of what exercise they should be doing, and they have access to all these things, and they've been putting in the work, and they're actually getting better to a certain degree. So really reassess, focus on the basics, make sure your joints actually work the way they should. You'll be good to go. Have an awesome weekend, you guys. I love you all. Until next time, share this podcast with friends and family. Give me a 5-star rating. Hit the show notes. Add me on Facebook, Instagram. Let's be friends. Let's do it. Until next time.